All right, welcome everybody. Those of you who are here and those of you who are watching online, we appreciate you tuning in. What's the sound like for you out there? Too loud? Fine? Okay. And besides, I'm not preaching, so I won't get any louder than this, so it should work. But thanks for tuning in or for being here. For those of you who are watching online, we would really like to have your feedback and conversation even though you're not here. So if you would like to, there's a feature there. I can't tell you exactly what it looks like, but there's a way for you to type in a question and send it to us, and then it will be fed down here, and somehow we'll find out what that question was and try to address it. So let's go ahead and begin. I want to begin with prayer, and then we'll have a conversation. Lord, I thank you for this place. I thank you for Evangelical Community Church, which has been a light in this community for a very long time now. I thank you for, in a personal way, for bringing me here. It's been a delightful 22 years, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the people of God in this place, and I'm grateful for your church. And we pray that as we consider this issue, you will give us insight into the direction that we ought to take, and that we will be united by your Spirit and led by your Spirit. In Christ's name, amen. Well, a few years ago now, it might have been 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly how long ago. The elders began a conversation just at the board meeting. Many of the elders who are on the board now would not even have been on that board at the time, began a conversation about the name evangelical and what it meant or what it had come to mean, and whether or not it was the best descriptor for our church, and whether or not we wanted to continue to use that name in our church title. So this conversation has been going on for a long time. I start out by saying that to make a point. We don't make decisions on the spur of the moment. We think about it for a long time, talk about it for a long time, pray about it for a long time. One of the things that we implemented a couple of years ago now was a survey concerning what the congregation thought of when they heard the word evangelical or what it meant to them. And then that was the internal survey. Then we did an external survey in the community to see what the community thought when they heard the word evangelical. Those results have been out there for a long time. If you don't have a copy of those results, we made them public. We had a conversation publicly about it. And the third session, this is the first, and then there's a second, and the third session, the elders will all be up here to discuss this issue, and we will roll out once again the survey to explain what it was, to give a recap of it, and the responses that came in. So tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to do most of the talking, give a major overview, and it will be a gallop through history of the history of evangelicalism, the name, what it was, and how it's changed, because there's no doubt it has changed over time. Next week, Dan is going to do the same thing basically that I'm doing, except he's going to talk about the definition of the term. How do you define it? What are the difficulties of the definition? Are they elusive enough, for instance, that it's hard to describe what it really means? So in both of these sessions, we'll give you a presentation, and Dan and I are going to be up here together both of these times, and he's going to, on your behalf, periodically, ask me a question right in the middle of my monologue, because I can go monologue. And he's going, wait, Bob, what do you mean by that? Or do you really mean this? Whatever he wants to say. I have no idea what he's going to say. He's nice enough to me. He's not going to try to throw me under the bus, but he'll help, right? He'll help you think about it. But at the end of it all, we really want to have a dialogue and have you ask questions as well to clarify some of the things that were presented and that sort of thing. So let's get started with the presentation itself. They told me to be patient with this thing. There we go. I'm being patient. This is the title. You've probably seen it on the web page, Evangelical, How the Name Has Changed. And today we're going to focus on the ways in which that is true. Now, I'm going to have to turn this way because the screen back there is very small print, and I can't see it, so I'm going to turn this way. So the first slide talks about the etymology of the word. That's basically the history of a word, right? So the etymology of the word, the first thing to know about evangelical is that it comes from a Greek word that is up there in italics, euangelion. And it basically means, the basic definition of evangelical is the good news about Jesus Christ. That's what it means, what it was originally intended to mean. It is a biblical word, just like the word salvation is a word that's used in the scripture. It's not a word like Trinity, which is imported to our Christian tradition and doesn't happen to be in the text, in the biblical text. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the Christian doctrine of Trinity. It's just to acknowledge the fact that there are words that are really important to us that don't appear in the Bible. This word, evangelical, actually appears in the Bible. Third thing to say about this, well, actually the fourth thing, I guess, the Great Awakening, for those of you who know much about church history, was a defining moment for the term evangelical. It's not like it didn't exist before now, right? Again, it's a biblical term. It was used in the Reformation a lot, but especially during the Great Awakening, it came alive, shall we say, okay? What was it about the Great Awakening that made evangelical become such an important word? Well, in the 1800s, go ahead, Dan, I knew it.
Can you just say something about what was the Great Awakening?
Yeah, I was going to say a little bit more about that in a minute, but thanks. We're going to work together really well. The Great Awakening was the first great revival in the United States and in England. And I'm going to show you 3 pictures in a minute that focus on 3 people who were part of the Great Awakening: John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards, and George Whitefield. So imagine a Great Awakening that's a revival in the United States and England primarily. And what happens during this time is that evangelical used to be a noun, right? It used to be evangelical. It used to be a verb, used to be evangelical. This person expresses things evangelically, you know, that it was like a word that went somewhere, not just a description of a person like a pronoun. The word has come to mean something else. Instead of the phrase, the good news concerning Jesus Christ, as of the 1800s, it was used sort of more like a noun pronoun. That person is an evangelical. Right? It's a shift that took place in the 1800s. Why did this shift take place? It took place because of the Great Awakening, because there were the key figures who were evangelical in terms of their theology and emphasized certain things, and people began to identify people as evangelicals. It wasn't so much that way before. So if you had been around the New Testament times, nobody would have said, that guy's an evangelical. As a matter of fact, if you've been around the 1600s, they probably wouldn't have said, he is an evangelical or that church is an evangelical church. It would have been a different way of using the word. But that changed during the Great Awakening. Major evangelical figures that contributed to this change, and this is where Dan was going, Jonathan Edwards. He was a key figure in the Great Awakening in the United States. He was a very strict Calvinist, if you know anything about the theology of Jonathan Edwards. But there were other people, and one of them is John Wesley. Now, you can't imagine theologically 2 people that were more polar opposite. John Wesley was a strict Arminian, and Jonathan Edwards was a strict Calvinist. I don't know if George Whitefield, if he were here, would appreciate this, but I'm going to call George Whitefield, whose picture should have been in there. Well, how about that? He didn't make the cut. There he is, George Whitefield. I'll call him the middle guy. George Whitefield was an evangelist, like Wesley. I don't think it was as Calvinistic. Dan, you tell me whether or not you think this is true, as Edwards was. He certainly was an Arminian like Wesley.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Right in the middle. So theologically, from the outset of the Great Awakening, we have a little bit of diversity theologically, representing sort of the wide array of English and American theologians. So during this time, what actually happens and what are the points of emphasis that are characteristic of evangelicalism? Here's what the preachers and the theologians were saying at the time that distinguished them as evangelical. First, they would say in sermons and in their writing, a Christian is not a person who's born in a Christian nation. Now, to us, that might be a big duh, right? Like, well, of course, you're not a Christian just because you were born in a Christian nation. That wasn't necessarily a big duh in the 17th century. People all over Europe considered themselves to be Christian because they were a part of a Christian nation. People in the United States considered themselves to be Christian because they were part of a Christian nation. They identified with the nation and with the religion that the nation embraced, and that made them who they were. Second thing is a Christian is not a person who was born into a family. That too would have been a common understanding. If you were to ask someone if you're a Christian, they might have said, yes, of course I am. And you ask why, and they might have said, well, because my parents are, and my grandparents were, and my great-grandparents were. I was born a Christian, and I remained a Christian. So these figures were pushing back on that to a certain extent, right? That's not what defines being a Christian, they would say. A Christian is also not a person who was a member of a church. So sometimes really in a disconcerting fashion, they were stirring up the pot in the revival time and saying, look, just because you come to the church, just because you say the right words, sing the right hymns, and actually believe the creeds, that doesn't mean you're a Christian. Being a Christian is something else beyond those things. Those are important, but it's something else. The thing that makes you a Christian is a relationship with Jesus Christ, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That was the thrust of the Great Awakening. Go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
Talking about stirring the pot, that theology almost got Edwards kind of run out of his church,
Yep.
which he had inherited from his father-in-law, Solomon Stoddard. And it's because he was pushing against that idea that you've been here your whole life doesn't mean you're a Christian. You need to be regenerated. Almost cost him the church.
Yeah, it did. It was it was a difficult time for Edwards, but he hung in there and made it and became, I think, indisputably America's greatest theologian. The amount of work he did, the writing he did was phenomenal. So what are the two characteristics of these theologian preachers that we would have called evangelical? One is revivalism, because they were all about revivals, reviving the church. Jonathan Edwards was too, not as a circuit-riding preacher like Wesley or Whitefield, but more as a pastor. And they were all about conversionism, that is to make a decision to follow Christ. That's what counted you as a member of the body of Christ. So that was the 1700s and 1800s. In the 1800s, something dramatic took place. It didn't take place in the United States, but it affected the United States dramatically. There was a new form of theology emerging in Europe among Christian theologians, primarily Germany. Now, it didn't mean it wasn't emerging other places, but the nerve center for the whole thing was a place called Tübingen University. Tübingen University became a hotbed for what is called modernism, or what some people call liberal theology, okay? So what were the characteristics of the Tübingen School of Theology? First, rejection of supernaturalism. And they even applied a Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament. I won't go into that, nobody cares. The Bible was studied as a purely historical document. That's what they did as scholars at Tübingen. It was not divinely inspired, they said, right? Things had changed. We're over our mythology. It's not divinely inspired. The Bible was an evolutionary process of religion. It's not authoritative. It just describes episodically what people believed about God. So you can see this progression of religion from the Old Testament prophets all the way up until the New Testament, and then to the time of Jesus, and then the authors of the Gospels, and then the epistles of Paul, and then the epistles of Peter. You get the sense? In other words, that's what the Bible is, a description of how all this evolved. It's the evolution of theology. It's not really authoritative. And so most of the books, according to them, were written by authors that did not bear their names. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were just names attached to the Gospels. They didn't write the books. Paul, for the most part, didn't write most of the epistles that are attributed to him, and likewise with others. They also identified various conflicting theologies in the New Testament, or what they believed to be conflicting theologies in the New Testament. For instance, they said, if you take a look at the synoptics, they're way different than the Gospel of John. There's a conflict there. That's because you have different theologies going on. And even within the synoptics, you have conflict between Matthew and Mark and Luke. And you can see the conflict any given place in the New Testament. And beyond that, there's a conflict when it comes to Paul's opinion of Jesus and Peter's opinion of Jesus. This is the kind of study that was going on at Tübingen. There was a corrective of sorts that was developed by Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth. Rudolf Bultmann was the one who came up with this notion of demythologizing the Scripture in order to find out spiritually what the deeper meaning was. Later, Karl Barth became just a tremendously influential theologian, and he was the person most associated with a thing called neo-orthodoxy, kind of the revision of some of the orthodox doctrines of the New Testament into modern-day theology. You got a comment on Tübingen? No. Okay. You didn't go there. You're not endorsing them. Okay. Yeah. So the reason I slide Tübingen in there is this. Until this time, when you're talking about the Great Awakening, you're talking about people who were mostly theologically on the same page, except for things like Calvinism, Arminianism, and other things. They were on the same page in what we often call, theologians, paleo-orthodoxy, which just means ancient orthodoxy. They were on the same page with the first 5 centuries of the church and the first 7 ecumenical creeds. They all agreed. They didn't have an argument about whether or not that the Bible was God's inspired word. They all believed it, right? They may have various different interpretations, but they believed it was authoritative. They believed in the virgin birth. They believed in miracles. They thought that was part and parcel of the Christian religion. But when Tübingen comes along and that revolution takes place, mass numbers of people in the Christian churches are moving in one direction or another, either modernist or what would be called fundamentalist. This guy right here, I've got his picture here, but I don't have it here. He broke it. All right.
Maybe it's time for them to turn around and crane their necks.
Yeah. Well, the picture's not that important, but it's a very severe picture. If you want to look at it behind you, and it doesn't come up, but that might mean none of the rest of them are going to come up either. A severe picture of a Princeton theologian whose name was Gresham Machen. Gresham Machen was a person who was pushing back on modernism. And he said, the church can't go down that route. If it goes down that route, we're going to lose our soul. Now, those are not exactly his words, but that's what I'm saying. We can't do that because that's not the essence of what the Christian religion is. The essence of the Christian religion, in fact, is fundamentally important. And he, being influential, helped create a new movement called the Fundamentalist. So you have Princeton, who becomes a modernist theology. Yale, that's modernist in its theology. Lots of other mainline kind of denominational seminaries, modernist in their theology. The modernist theologians won the day, and Gresham Machen said, I can't do it. As a matter of fact, he started his own seminary, or was influential in the starting of the seminary, called Westminster Theological Seminary. Now a PCA seminary, I believe, associated with the Presbyterian Church of America. OPC, okay, OPC. So Gresham Machen is influential in starting this new seminary. It first was on the West Coast, I believe Philadelphia, and then eventually they have a center in Escondido, California. I know, for instance, I was there as a very young man, as the courier for Harold Lindsell, for any of you who might know him. That was the West Coast version of Westminster Theological Seminary. And Gresham Machen was saying, look, this can't be. We can't go there. We have to hold the line. What was the line he wanted to hold? Here's the line, basically, he wanted to hold. Well, let's go past that. I can't go past that because I'm off track, and I will back up. It's not working, man. Stop working. Back up to, there's where I wanted to go. Yep. All right. So what were the issues that Machen thought were essential to the Christian faith and to what he called fundamentalism and later people called fundamentalism? They were these. The deity of Christ, we can't let that one go, right? It's essential. The virgin birth, can't let that one go. It's essential. Sacrificial atonement of Christ, can't let that one go. It's essential. Bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, absolutely necessary. The inspiration and authority of Scripture, absolutely necessary. What is interesting about these 5 fundamentals? If they are 5 things, almost word for word, that the Tübingen school had dismissed, right? So the fundamentalists are saying the Tübingen school is going down the wrong road, and we're going to place a stake in the ground, and we're going to say, this is as far as we can go. We can't go any further. That's what originally fundamentalism was. That's it. Now, it's gonna change, but that's what it was. It was theologians who said, we have to stick to the basics of the Christian faith. Like I say, it's changed a lot. I don't even know where we are in the slides now, Adam.
Can I say something like
Yeah,
about,
go ahead. Go back to William Jennings Bryan while he says something.
So yeah. Machen, we call him a fundamentalist, but he is not your stereotypical fundamentalist because he was against prohibition when a lot of Christians really wanted him to be for prohibition. He refused to testify at the Scopes trials, the evolution, creation, and science classes kind of trials. He was actually a radical libertarian when it came to his politics. He was actually against stop signs in town because he thought that was government overreach. So.
Yeah.
Just a weird guy.
He was. He was an interesting fellow. And when you think of fundamentalism, you wouldn't think of him. But that's back when fundamentals meant something different. It's the fundamentals. So enter this guy into the historical timeline. This is William Jennings Bryan. Okay, he's not a theologian. He actually was a 3-time candidate for the presidency. Very popular in the United States. And he comes to the forefront because he merges what he considered to be 2 cultural enemies, not enemies of one another, but 2 things that were enemies of the American culture. The first was Darwinism, and the second was modernism. William Jennings Bryan said, these 2 things are going to destroy the United States if we don't keep them under control. You know the Scope trials that Dan just mentioned. The backstory on that, there was a high school science teacher who was asked by those who were modernists and wanted to promote Darwinism whether or not he actually had taught Darwinian evolution in the classroom. And his answer was, well, I'm not sure, but it is in the textbook, so I must have. And they said, aha, you're our guy. Why? Because there was a law against talking about Darwinianism in the classroom as if it was scientific fact in the state of Tennessee. So they had him as their chief example of a person who was violating the law. William Jennings Bryan was on the side of the conservatives who said, you can't do this, you can't teach it as a fact in the public schools. And the modernist theologians, Clarence Darrow, they were on the other side, saying that you ought to be able to have freedom of intellectual inquiry even at the high school level. Darwinianism is science, leave it alone, let it speak for itself. Well, at the end of the day, William Jennings Bryan wins the case, but he loses public favor. As a matter of fact, what a lot of people don't know is William Jennings Bryan died before he ever left Dayton, Tennessee. Following the trial, only a few days later, he died of a heart attack. So his legacy was sort of over. But what was it about William Jennings Bryan? He was a cultural warrior, and he was a spokesperson for an emerging fundamentalism. As Dan just mentioned, interestingly enough, not the fundamentalism of Gresham Machen. Completely different sort. So a different version of fundamentalism is growing. And it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-science, it's very conservative in every way. William Jennings Bryan had a big influence on a lot of people, and on one particular occasion, I wonder if I can advance it now. Can I? Give me a new slide then, Adam. At one particular point, actually at a conference, a Bible conference at Wheaton College, he was sitting next to a young man that was a friend of his, and he turned to the young man and he said these words. Go back, I want the words. If schools and colleges in the United States don't stop teaching evolution as a fact, we will become a nation of atheists. That was the way he approached the divide. The young man that was listening was taking it in very, very carefully. And the young man's name, you can advance to the next slide, was Bob Jones Sr. Now, for those of you who don't know Bob Jones Sr. and Bob Jones University, there's an emerging legacy of fundamentalism happening right there, coming out of William Jennings Bryan, okay? Bob Jones and Bob Jones University were clearly, again, different than Machen, and clearly, again, different than neo-evangelicals that we're going to talk about in a minute. Do you have a comment? Okay, advance the next slide. So I want to give you a side-by-side comparison. This is totally inadequate, but it gives you an idea. A side-by-side comparison of two institutions, one Bob Jones and the other Wheaton. Wheaton College was committed to the authority of Scripture, but also intellectual integrity, right? They didn't kick Darwin out as a theory. They talked about it. They talked about everything. They talked about modernism. They dug deep. They were the first college, most people don't know this, they were the first college to admit and graduate a black student. It wasn't Northwestern University or University of Illinois. It was Wheaton. Billy Graham was one of Wheaton's, well, probably Wheaton's most famous graduates. Now, before I go to Bob Jones, let me say this. Billy Graham is a young Christian who is absolutely compelled by God to share the gospel. That's all that consumed him. He went to Bob Jones University as a student to prepare for the ministry. Couldn't hack it. He left because he thought it was too fundamentalist and too radical. He went to Florida Bible Institute in Florida to prepare further. Before it was all over, Billy Graham basically decided he couldn't live there either, and he moved to Wheaton College, which is where he graduated. Billy Graham, of course, became the most famous international evangelical evangelist of all time. I don't know how much you know about the statistics on Billy Graham, but this fact is true, and it's a remarkable fact, that Billy Graham preached the gospel to more people than any individual in the history of the world. That's how big his influence was. And he was all about the gospel, what you might call the evangelical gospel of Jesus Christ. Bob Jones, on the other hand, was taking a different direction. Their curriculum was basically designed to do battle with modernism and Darwinism. They accepted absolutely no black students. They were what was often called a segregationist academy, and there was no interracial dating. At one point, Billy Graham came to Greenville, South Carolina to do a crusade there, and Bob Jones got up and announced to the student body that if they went to the campaign, they would be expelled from school. They could never go to a Billy Graham crusade. Why? Because as Bob Jones said, Billy Graham was doing more harm to the cause of Jesus Christ than any living man. That's an extreme statement. I don't care if you like Billy Graham or not, but seriously, that kind of animosity towards a person who's proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ from a supposedly supportive Christian? I don't understand it. It wasn't until 1983, and only pressured by the Supreme Court, a decision that the Supreme Court made, that Bob Jones University integrated their university and allowed for black students. And it wasn't until the year 2000 that Bob Jones University finally allowed interracial dating. The year 2000. So what is this narrative saying, among other things? Okay? What the narrative is saying is that there's this fissure going on after William Jennings Bryan. A fundamentalist direction to the right and what I will call an evangelical direction to the left, all within the parameters of paleo-orthodoxy. And this fissure is very pronounced among fundamentalist churches. They were the ones that railed against the civil rights movement. They were the ones that railed against communism, for good reason. And they were the ones that railed against any form of a conversation about the possibility that a theory of evolution could somehow be consistent with the biblical text. That was what they did, and they did it really, really well. On the other hand, as things began to develop, Bob Jones begins to become the sort of the distant past in terms of the influence of evangelicalism, and it happens with these three people primarily. The one to the far left is Carl Henry. The one in the middle is Harold Ockenga, and of course you know the one to the right, Billy Graham. Those guys were new leaders at the time. They called themselves the neo-evangelicals. Why did they do that? They called themselves the neo-evangelicals. It's really simple. Because they thought the word evangelical that had been used beforehand might have been somehow damaged, and they wanted people to know that they were the new evangelicals. We're a new kind of evangelical. We still believe the fundamentals, but we're not fundamentalists, right? So from there, a lot of things happened. It happened rather quickly and profound. Fuller Seminary was established by this man, Harold Ockenga. That's in California. He also established World Relief, which still is in operation today, and he established the National Association of Evangelicals. Now, what you can't see from those photographs very well, see over on the far right, that's a choir. And again, what you cannot see is that probably at least 40% of the choir members are African American. It was at an NAE celebration. That kind of thing would never happen at Bob Jones or a fundamentalist church. It just would not happen. They integrated early on and made it clear. Over here to the left in the bottom, you may recognize that from here, I don't know. That's Ronald Reagan. And he's speaking at the NAE National Conference, National Association of Evangelicals. To the right of Ockenga, much darker picture, there are three people in the picture. From right to left, those are theologians, and the one to the far left is Barack Obama. The reason politicians wanted to talk to evangelicals is because they knew they had powerful influence with their constituency. And ever since the 1940s, at least, maybe before, politicians have always sought out evangelical leaders to help their cause. It's just been the way it goes. Politicians do this. I want to tell one other quick story about Billy Graham to distinguish him from Bob Jones and Bob Jones University. Billy Graham was having a crusade in Los Angeles. And at the time, it was just common custom. Nothing unusual about it. That you segregated your audience. Black people sat over here, white people sat over there. There were actually ropes that segregated the congregation or the audience. Billy Graham went to the first opening ceremony of the campaign. And he walked over and he started taking the ropes down, one by one. And he announced to the press that was always following him, he said that either these ropes come down and stay down, or they can find themselves another preacher for this revival. Early on, Billy Graham was making a statement. Neo-evangelicals are not against the life of the mind, Neo-evangelicals are not racist. Neo-evangelicals are about the gospel of Jesus Christ first and only, right? One more story about Billy Graham. The biggest regret he had in his entire life was getting involved in politics at all. He lamented it because he said it took the focus off of the gospel. He was, for a time, great friends with Richard Nixon. And man, did that come back to bite him. So evangelicalism, at least at this time, was not a political identification at all. It was about the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's a picture of Billy Graham. Could give you others. What about this? Dan, you got anything else?
A question for you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there was this fork with fundamentalism and evangelicalism, and I absolutely understand that that was an internal distinction.
Right.
Were people outside making that same distinction, do you think?
I'd say from the 1950s on they were.
Okay.
Because of Billy Graham and Harold Ockenga
Okay.
and Carl Henry.
I think you're right for a time, and then I think they started to merge again.
It did. Yes, it has
Okay.
merged. I'm getting to that. Unfortunately, I think it has merged. Yeah. But there was a distinction back then. As a matter of fact, to put it another way, Dan, that's a good question. Put it another way, there was a time where fundamentalism almost completely faded off the horizon. They went into retreat. They went away from the spectacle of the world. Yeah, I mean, how many people do you know today that go around saying, I'm a fundamentalist, right? Probably nobody, because it's associated with lots of things like fundamentalist Islamic beliefs and stuff like that. Hardly anybody ever says they're a fundamentalist. They would have said that in the 1940s, but that changed, and for good reason, I think, yeah. So the evolution of evangelicalism, what did it look like? It was an interdenominational movement in America and Great Britain. And we should say this, that it really was an English phenomenon in this way, right? It didn't mean that the idea of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news concerning Jesus Christ, was not global. But as an identity, it really was an English and American thing. It distinguished itself between modernism and fundamentalism. In other words, what was early called, by the way, they stopped calling it neo-evangelicalism because the name didn't roll off the tongue very well. They just started calling it evangelicals. But at the beginning, they were distinguishing themselves from the modernists and were siding theologically with the fundamentals. Fundamentalists retreat, and the retreat probably related to those two things. They refused to engage, science and intellectualism. The emergence of neo-evangelicalism, a call to social action and a broadening of the tent. That was characteristic of the evangelical movement that emerged in the 1940s. Billy Graham's invitation at his crusades was always to all Christians. He had Catholics, he had Greek Orthodox, he had mainline ministers, he had people who did not agree with him on all the doctrines that he embraced as an evangelical who were on his platform, who would actually offer prayers at his crusades, right? He broadened the tent. He didn't want to be so narrow. That was Billy Graham, always was, to his dying day. He knew who he was. He had a constant center, but he was very gracious to other people who wanted to call themselves Christians. He established Christianity Today, formation of NAE, and the creation of World Relief. Those are the things that evolve out of evangelicalism. Now this picture, George Wallace and Jerry Falwell. So if you were to ask me to give a date where things begin to change significantly, I would give the date of the 1980s. I would say in the 1980s, things begin to change. In the 1980s, evangelicalism became associated with politics in a way it had not been before. Jerry Falwell started a university, as you know, early on dubbed a segregationist academy when it was just Lynchburg Christian School. But there were institutions all over the South that were dubbed segregation academies because they wouldn't allow black students to be a part. And Jerry Falwell wouldn't allow black students to be a part of his institution in the early days. This is a picture with him, and you might know the face. It's Governor Wallace, a very famous segregationist in Alabama. They were ideological brothers. at least early on. I'm not sure where Jerry Falwell was when it was all over, but he definitely was with George Wallace to begin with. Early in its history, Liberty University is categorized as a segregationist university. And Jerry Falwell himself said this: when God has drawn a line of distinction, namely, this was in reference to race, drawn a line of distinction, we should not attempt to cross that line. What did he mean? He meant that we ought to be separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson, if any of you know your history. He meant that there should be no such thing as interracial dating. He meant that there should be no such thing as interracial marriage, because that was the line that God had drawn. It strains logic for me to understand where God drew that line, but he thought it was true. The tipping point for evangelicals in the 1980s comes with a thing called the moral majority, led by Jerry Falwell. And there were two main issues. One was segregationism, or when they were forced to when they were forced to integrate, and also abortion. Those two things, I think, more than anything else, were a tipping point. Carter was elected in 1976, and it was either Time Magazine or Newsweek that named that the year of the evangelical, 1976, because Carter proclaimed himself a Southern Baptist evangelical. He was elected really on the backs of evangelicals, and from then on, evangelicalism was inseparably linked to politics in a way it hadn't been before. Now the new landscape changes. We're talking about the 1980s now. Modernists are Modernists are political, and theological liberals are the enemy. That's what I meant to say there. Evangelicals are political conservatives, no matter what their theology. In popular parlance, an evangelical has now almost no theological content. Now, you don't have to agree with me when I say, and I'll just be honest, that I think evangelical is not a term that's redeemable for a church. But surely you can agree with me that in modern culture today, it's got almost no theological content at all. It's only got theological content on the inside. Whenever you hear evangelical in modern parlance in the news, it could be a conservative Catholic, it could be a conservative evangelical, or it could be a white nationalist. Just read the newspapers. That's what it is now. Whether we like it or not, that's what we're dealing with. Jerry Falwell does a great job of working the circuit in terms of politics. He's great friends with Ronald Reagan. He's very influential with him. His son does as good a job, and he's very influential with Donald Trump. Franklin Graham sitting next to Donald Trump. Now, I don't use this picture to say there's anything wrong with Franklin Graham sitting next to a president, because his father, Billy Graham, did it all the time, right? He just didn't talk about politics and get into the details. That's different than his son, Franklin. Franklin is very explicit about his politics. He's very explicit about his politics as an evangelical. And he has contributed to the evangelical understanding of itself as a political entity as much as anybody else. I don't know what his father would have thought about where he is now, but I know for sure that he's not his father's son in regard to politics. That was not Billy Graham. Franklin Graham has shifted his emphasis. The evolution of the word, what's it look like? And then I'm done. Once evangelical had a distinctive theological definition, it still does to me. It still does. I embrace it. But it doesn't popularly. The word evangelical evolved from the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Evangelicalism distinguished itself as intellectually robust. Think about Wheaton College and Fuller Theological Seminary. They engaged the issues of the day. Evangelicalism was not a form of isolationism. It was out there. Evangelicalism was socially active without partisan politics. It was in the street doing the work that needed to be done without being partisan. Evangelicalism has now become a political voting bloc. It's either a conservative Protestant or a conservative Catholic or a white nationalist or name any other description you want. And people will often refer to them as evangelicals. And if you haven't experienced that, I wish you would. You know why? Because I experience it all the time. So when I'm in this community, and at some point somebody asks me what I do, I start out this way. I say I'm a pastor, and inevitably the next question is, what church do you pastor? You might expect my answer. I'd say it's a church called ECC. I don't want to use the word. And frequently people will say, what does ECC mean? And then, I'm honest, I say Evangelical Community Church. And it's a conversation stopper. If I am able, it takes me another half hour to describe to them what evangelical means. Because they have an entrenched notion of what it is. And it doesn't mean anything similar to what I think it means and what its history is. So you might ask yourself, well, so what? A lot of words are like that. That's true. You might say to yourself, well, Christian is that way. To a certain extent, depending on the historical landscape, that might have been true as well. But the question for me is, if the word is not absolutely essential to identifying who you are, and the reality of who you are is essentially who you are without the name, why use a name that creates a barrier? That's why I never use it. So I end with a story. Must have been, 10 years ago, dear? We were traveling in England for a vacation. And it wasn't a mission trip, so we don't do very well on vacations because we are just together with the two of us and we argue too much. And we were not having a good time. Let's just be honest, okay? It's not a marriage conference, but I'll tell you, we were not having a good time. We were snitting at each other and we were just in a mess. And near the end of the trip, probably 4 or 5 days into the trip, it would have been Sunday. We had already decided we wanted to do this. We wanted to go to a church that John Stott was famous for being the pastor at. So if you ask me one person that I would want to emulate as a pastor more than anybody else, it's John Stott. If you ask me about one person that I think is the best representation of evangelicalism, I would say John Stott. Just telling you. We went to his church. He was long gone, retired for many years. They were in their third pastor by that time. I knew the other one at a conference that I attended. We went to the church. It was amazing. You know what it was? It was an older downtown Anglican church with all the trappings of Anglicanism all over it. And not a single identification of evangelical anywhere. But when we started singing, I looked around the balcony, and people behind me, in front of me, and I saw people from every country all over the world. And you know what they were singing? They were all singing with one voice praise songs that we all knew in the contemporary world of churches among evangelicals. And they were singing the great old hymns that all of us knew by heart. And the pastor got up and he proclaimed an evangelical gospel and talked about the importance of world missions and the trip that he had been on. And my goodness, I'm not an Anglican, but I felt like I was at home. I thought to myself, these are my people. I was in a comfortable place. And it was nothing like ECC. And the name evangelical wasn't 1,000 miles away. They just were. They didn't call themselves that. They just were. So my ending comment is this. I am an evangelical. I'm not convinced I need to have it on the name of the church that I pastor in order for it to have meaning. And it might be better if it's not there. But that's up to you guys. You who are watching, you who are sitting here, you're the people who vote on this. We just wanted to have the conversation. Now I'm done with the monologue. Go ahead.
Good, no.
Anybody else?
So someone, I think Megan commented, she says, Bob, I do that all the time too. I'm assuming try to avoid saying evangelical community church.
Okay. Yeah, somebody wrote in a question, yeah.
Yeah, it was just a comment.
Okay.
And I know when we go to campus to do campus stuff, and we're promoting Connection, and they ask, what's Connection? I say it's the college ministry of ECC, a non-denominational community church just on the south side of campus. I, again, avoid the name evangelical almost at all cost, short of lying.
Yeah. That's because you're not an evangelical, right?
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, he's going to talk about that next week. What does it mean? How do you define it? It's all over the map, but yeah. Any other questions that have come in online or?
Nothing online
all
right
right,
now.
so you guys, you got to carry the water here. Go ahead, Katie. It's a good question. She said, how long do you feel like we've been fighting the battle with the term evangelical? I'm trying to think experientially rather than historically because I don't think I can speak for the church. But I would say in the last decade, I feel like I've been fighting the battle. What would you say?
Yeah, I don't think I knew enough. See, I came here 16 years ago, and I didn't know enough of the baggage of what that name meant until probably 10 to 12 years ago. So early on, I had no qualms using it, and was sometimes puzzled at the blowback I got from my upbringing, which was a fundamentalist upbringing.
Right.
Evangelical meant liberal. So that I came here, and I'm an evangelical, and looked like people were looking at me like I had three heads, and I didn't know why until I kind of dug in and what is evangelicalism, our history, what does it mean now? So I would say the last 10 to 12, personally, I felt that.
If I can just play off your question a minute, Katie. One thing that's interesting about the history of this church is when they very deliberately chose the word evangelical to identify the church, evangelical community church, they did it, and those who were here years ago who were actually present, I wasn't, said that the main reason for that is they wanted to distinguish themselves from fundamentalism. So in the 1970s, there was a clear distinction between evangelical and fundamentalist. So that far back, I would say, I was just a kid in the 70s, but that far back, I would say it didn't have as many problems associated with it. It actually was a good thing. And that's why the church chose that name. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there has been. You're jumping ahead. I don't want to reveal that. And in the third session, when the board is all up here, we have a proposal. Yep. But yeah, thanks for the question.
But it's really good.
Right, okay. Yep. Vicki asked the question, Vicki Getty back here asked the question about what was the alternative name. And I said in the third session, when the board is all up here together, we're going to give a proposal. Yeah. Right, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't say that either, but I couldn't hear it through the mask at first. I thought I understood it. But Vicki was saying that she understands what Dan and I are describing from working on campus as a teacher there. She constantly does the same thing. She does everything she can to avoid the name evangelical because it puts her in a corner that she has to explain her way out of all the time. So, yes, sir. Yeah.
I believe that at some point Christians, evangelicals, or whoever has to stand up to the call, to the cancel culture, and to put it down. You know, there's a lot of criticism because you're a white, old white man. Well, you aren't as old as I am.
Yeah, I qualify.
Old white man, okay? There's criticism to that.
Yeah,
So I can't change the color.
right.
I can get older, possibly, but I don't have to get older. I can take it back right away. So I can't operate in this community because I'm an old white man.
Yeah.
We can't operate in this community because we consider ourselves evangelical.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug, for the question. That was a long question, but I'm going to try to summarize it for you guys who are out there. Doug basically said your description is that you're struggling with the name evangelical in this community, IU, the Bloomington community. It has negative connotations, and you deal with that, which is the thing that Dan and I both described. And why should we sort of cave into the criticism of that word in this community? In other words, the implication is that the word doesn't have the same connotation in other places that it might have in a very small or liberal town. I will say this, Doug, I travel the world, and I feel the same way about the word evangelical no matter where I am. In other words, I am concerned about using it because everywhere I go, unless a person happens to be an evangelical, the connotation is there. So what I experience in Bloomington is not different than what I experience in Florida or Connecticut or overseas. It's consistent. Now, whether or not that's caving in, that's a good question, right? But I can tell you that it's not just about a Bloomington phenomena for me. It's everywhere I go. In response to the why change or conform, if I thought that a name change was some form of theological caving in or conformity, I'd be against it. I'm not against standing up for what I believe. I'm not against telling people about Jesus Christ and sharing the gospel. I'm not against arguing for the importance of theological orthodoxy. I'm not against any of those things. And anybody on campus who knows me, and I say that because I teach, everybody knows that. They know who I am. And I'm not backing out of any room or anything else without people knowing who I am. If I'm asked, I tell them. Furthermore, in this community and in any other place I am, I frequently associate with people who are so far to the left of me, I hardly even recognize them, theologically or philosophically. And every single one of them knows who I am. So, for instance, you were not going to do it. None of you are going to do this. You wouldn't be asked to do it. But if you were asked to go to what is called the Interfaith Ministers Association or Religious Association in town, Interfaith Association, you would find at any of those given meetings people who were Buddhist, people who were Jews, people who were Methodist and Presbyterian and Lutheran, and the list goes on. And I'm telling you, Doug, if there's 12 people at the table, there's only one evangelical there, and it's me. And they have no question about who I am and what I stand for. But still, I'd rather not the name be a stumbling block because it allows me to have a better conversation just to be a representative of the gospel of Jesus Christ rather than use the name that just kind of throws up a wall before I have a conversation. So that's the reason for me. I don't know, Dan, what?
Yeah, and I mean, I live out in Ellettsville, and this past winter when we had that big snow, I was shoveling out with the help of another neighbor, and just started talking, and they are not Bloomington, they are not liberal, but they had definite opinions of what evangelical meant. And as soon as she heard Evangelical Community Church, the conversation went in a totally defensive direction, and I was having to explain, no, it's not that, no, it's not that, no, it's not that. And she's not affiliated with the university. She's not from Bloomington. She's from Terre Haute. So, it's not just a liberal versus conservative political ideology that has damaged the name evangelical. And I would be all for standing behind the name if I thought it still had theological content to it. But the theological content has, over the decades, been hollowed out and just filled with culture and political baggage, not meaningful theological baggage. And I'm going to talk about that next week, because the evangelical label theologically has been applied to people so far. Heretics are called evangelicals, and I don't want to be associated with them theologically, no matter where they're at, politically. And so it's a very hollow theological word now. It didn't used to be. I 100% would admit that. But to some extent, context defines words for us. So if you were in Germany nowadays, modern Germany, you would never name your church an evangelical church, because in that context, evangelical means state Lutheran church. The context there defines what the word means. The context here in America has defined what evangelical means, and it's not what we mean when we use it on a Sunday morning. It's been hollowed out of that kind of content and invested with other content that most of us wouldn't want to embrace.
Yes, sir.
I read some of the survey. I'm not a bigot, okay? But I don't have any problem saying I'm evangelical.
Right.
I'm not racist either, and I don't have any problem saying evangelical. And those are some of the terms that are associated with I saw in your survey, okay? Well, I think we've done just a pretty poor job, and sometimes I use colorful language, but I'll say a pretty poor job of telling this community, because we aren't going to get many people from Germany or Sweden or even Colorado, okay?
Yeah.
But I happen to lump in here.
Yeah.
And so I think that we ought to spend more time on changing our name as to really telling the community what evangelical people stand for. And the other thing is that you probably can't go out there and say Jesus Christ in your circles without being criticized for saying Jesus Christ. Okay?
And I won't stop saying Jesus Christ because I'm criticized. Yeah. Yeah, I will. And I have to push back just a little bit, Doug. My entire existence in this community for 22 years has been trying to help people understand what the word evangelical means. I haven't dropped the ball. It's been part of what I do. Okay. Yeah.
But we as a church either,
Uh-huh.
I can't say through our paper or through advertisement of some kind,
Right.
but all of us, I don't do it either, but maybe we ought to start rather than just squeak it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
We have.
Tim, all the way in the back. Yeah. It doesn't matter who.
I've got some online too, so
Oh,
after
okay.
these
All right,
two.
go ahead.
All or relating to or being in agreement with
Shelby. Shelby, can I interrupt you? Because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, I've talked to him, there's people in the church too who didn't come here for 5 years they moved here to Bloomington, didn't come here for 5 years because of what evangelical meant to them. And then eventually they came and said, oh, you're not at all what I thought you were. And so it was a barrier to, I would say, probably more people than it has been an attraction to people. The name. Absolutely. Do you want to? Absolutely.
Yeah,
and I just don't want to put barriers unnecessarily to people. So,
Yeah. So,
do you want to go to Tim, and then I'll get some of
all
these
right.
from...
Go ahead, Tim.
Do you want me to start?
Well, it was addressed to you, so you start. I got
Sure,
plenty
sure.
to say, but yeah.
Yeah. From my personal perspective, the name evangelical on the sign outside does nothing to anchor us theologically, where the statement of faith that we've adopted does. Because the term evangelical is so broad, I can line up, up here a whole bunch of heretics that are evangelical, called that, and I don't want to align with any of them. You could look at a church in town called Evangelical Lutheran Church that denies all the fundamentals of the faith that we would want to embrace. So that label by itself doesn't anchor us theologically, where the statement of faith does. And I'll speak for myself, not changing one iota of my belief. I think I've become, in some ways, more rigorous in some of my beliefs, more confessional in some of my beliefs over the years, not less.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things I want to say. Tim, we didn't kind of repeat Tim's question, but it was long. So let me try to say this. Tim suggested that changing the name might be a shift in a direction that's ambiguous. And for instance, when you have categories, denominational labels like Presbyterian, Episcopal, Methodist, it has some meaning. But if evangelical goes away, the church has really no identity. It's just church, or whatever the name is we use. And I've heard that before. I guess probably, Tim, one of the places you and I would have difference on is that I think denominational labels are more about polity than they are about theology. So there are a variety of Presbyterian churches, and the Presbyterian churches in the north are considerably different theologically than ones in the south. Presbyterian USA is dramatically different than the PCA. The Presbyterian Church of America is significantly different than the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The Episcopal Church is different all over the place. When I was an American Baptist, ordained American Baptist, it was well known in the denomination that the Northeast were liberals. In other words, most of my colleagues were virtual Unitarians, but if I'd have had a church in the Southwest, they would have been conservative, almost fundamentalist, all within the same denomination. So theological identity linked to a denomination doesn't seem to be that helpful to me. It seems more like what is most helpful is to understand, as Dan was saying, the statement of faith, and quite frankly, this sounds very egocentric, the leadership. In other words, what does the leadership say about what are the fundamental doctrines that it embraces? Maybe we need to have another conversation. Maybe you feel that I've drifted theologically. I don't feel like I have. I feel like I'm right on the center of orthodoxy. I haven't changed that a bit. I know Dan hasn't. I know John hasn't. So far as I know, the members of the Board of Elders are the same way. So in terms of theological identity, I think we're really very foundational. We understand who we are. If you go to the adult community groups and listen to the teaching there, and you walk away and you think, what kind of church this is, and you think liberal church, you haven't been in the ACG, right? If you think evangelical church, then you've been in the ACG. Apart from the name, it is what it is. So I would say it's more about the content of the teaching than it is about the name on the outside of the church. And I would say that the denominational distinctive really doesn't anchor us hardly at all. So, you know as much about the Episcopal Church as I do, especially in England. You got somebody like N.T. Wright at one level. You got somebody like John Stott at another level. You got people like David Edwards at another level who are far to the left, all Episcopal. So, yeah, go ahead.
So question from online from quite a while ago is, do we know if other churches in Bloomington or outside of Bloomington are wrestling with the label evangelical also?
Well, I don't know any other churches in Bloomington that are named evangelical anything except for the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and that happens to be a denomination, not a particular church. So I guess the answer would be no. In terms of an identity on a sign, the idea that they're wrestling with the idea of being evangelical, yeah.
Yeah, the identity for sure.
Yeah.
Someone also commented that they know Red Cedar Evangelical in Michigan changed their name to Red Cedar Church recently.
Yeah. An older member of the congregation came up to me last week and told me about a number of churches in the Michigan area that had changed their names for similar reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. But there, this move to a name change is not just about evangelical. It's been going on for 30, 40 years related to denominations. So, for instance, denominations at some point sometimes have got a stereotype attached to them that the congregation or the leadership wishes not to be identified with. And that was the case for my dad's church before he passed away. It was called Eastside Church of the Nazarene, I believe, originally. And they went through a congregational name change, and they changed it to Grace Community Church. because they thought the identifiers of the Nazarene church sort of boxed them into a corner, and they wanted to be more broad in terms of their definition. My dad, of course, was an evangelical, but they changed that name. Yeah. What do you got there?
Got another one that just came in. Has our name hindered our ability to partner with others? How much of a barrier does it create with Beth Shalom, creation care efforts, etc.? Did that require conversations to overcome?
Hours and hours and weeks and months. That's the answer to that question. I have invested so much time overcoming what an evangelical is in their minds that I can't even count the hours. And I did it with great delight because I'm an evangelical and I believe in it. That's why I did it, because I believe what I believe. But I don't need the label in order for me to do the proclamation of the gospel. As a matter of fact, I wish I didn't have to spend 3 weeks explaining what it was so I could get to the heart of the matter. Bud, you were getting ready to say something. Oh, can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was, has our name, Evangelical Community Church, hindered our ability to partner with others like Beth Shalom, Creation Care Partners, etc.? And that's what Bob was just answering.
Yes. It's been huge. A big problem. And I continue to work with it. That's fine. You know, here's the other thing I want to tell you. We changed the name from Evangelical Community Church to something else. I'm not leaving unless you kick me out. If we keep the name, I'm not leaving unless you kick me out. I don't care. At the end of the day, I'm going to proclaim the same gospel I have always been proclaiming. And I don't care whether or not the name is on the front of the church, identifies me as well as I wish for it to. I'm still going to proclaim the gospel. But I would prefer not to have a roadblock. That's all.
And there's a lot of labels that I would embrace personally as a Christian that I don't think make good names for the church. Right. For example, I want to call myself a Christian, right? We all do. But to put the name out there, Christian Community Church would not be a great church name because it would identify us with the Christian denomination. I call myself a Reformed Christian. That wouldn't be a good name for the church because not everyone in here is Reformed. So just because I want to own a label, and I want to own the evangelical label too, doesn't mean it's necessarily a helpful name for a church. I would call myself a Catholic Christian, but we wouldn't call ourselves a Catholic Community Church.
I agree, 100%. All those labels I would adopt readily, yeah.
So, you keep saying that you're very evangelical. If we change the name of the church away from that, won't the people still have the same hindrance when they begin talking to you about theology and other things? Will they still not have the same barriers, even if the name of the church is changed?
If that's true, we need to repeat it.
Yeah.
And your question was whether or not if we change the name, and you tell me if I'm repeating it well, change the name away from evangelical, whether or not when I describe what evangelical means or proclaim the gospel as I understand it, that will become a barrier or a problem, right? Is that the essence of your question? And the answer to the question, of course it will. It'll still be a problem. It's called the offense of the gospel, right? So when the gospel is proclaimed, people are offended. I can't stop proclaiming the gospel just because people are offended. There's a sense in which I continue to proclaim because they're offended, because that's what the gospel does. So no, it won't change everything. What it will do, it will allow me to have a conversation about the gospel, the good news concerning Jesus Christ, out of the gate. I'll at least be on second base and not at home plate. I will have advanced somewhere so I can actually have the conversation, and I won't be dismissed out of hand.
Without, a half hour, 45-minute discussion about politics, about race, about XYZ before you even get
the gospel
to Jesus.
Yeah, right. Amy. Yeah, so to repeat Amy's comment, as she says, not a question, she said that her son, who's only 18 years old, won't tell his friends that he goes to Evangelical Community Church. He only says ECC because his experience, as soon as he says that, they assume certain things and he can't get past first base with them in terms of a conversation. And she wishes that wasn't true for him. So you have another question? I don't know. It's 4:30. Maybe we should.
Yeah,
We do have an opportunity next week, so don't forget to come back next week because we'll get to do more of this. Yes, go ahead. Yes, I think that's who you were pointing to.
Yeah, you raised your hand, right, Suzanne?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah. So thank you, Suzanne. That's I want to make sure everybody hears that out there who's tuning in. Suzanne said she visited Bob Jones University not long ago, and they have basically a display that's an apology for their racist background and the ways in which they reinforce segregation. And I've heard that as well, though I haven't been there for the museum and things like that. So even fundamentalists who formerly would have been, really recalcitrant against Billy Graham and people like that, they've modified and changed. Yeah. So, yeah. And Moody, you also mentioned Moody admitting a black student. What? Yeah, way back when, whatever. Yeah. So I can't say how far way back when was, but it's a long time ago. Yeah. It's before the 1960s, for sure. Yeah. Got anything else you want to jump in?
Should I take 2 minutes to describe what I'm talking about next week?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, so next week, we've thrown around, Shelby, you read a definition of what evangelical means. I'm going to talk about that. Is that a sufficient definition? When you read that, to me, that applies to every Christian globally. So how does it define us as a subset of Christians? So we'll talk about how do we define it theologically and the struggle to define it theologically, and it'll be definitely interactive back and forth if you want it to be. How do we define it denominationally? What denominations count? Maybe it's more of an ethos, and we'll talk about that too. So that's what we'll be heading into next week.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to Dan's description of all this because he's done a lot of work on this. And also, it does harken back to Shelby's comment about going online and getting a definition for evangelical. I understand the definition that you pulled up, but you could have pulled up 100 more too. They're everywhere. The definition of evangelical is all over the map, and that's what he's going to talk about next week. And what do we do with that, right? If it has almost no meaning because of the variety of meanings, how does it help us? Or does it not help us? Or do we keep it? Or we don't? Yeah. It's been a great evening. I hope you feel like it has been. I do. I've enjoyed it very much. Look forward to next week, 3 o'clock. We'll see you then. We do want to move out of here because the Connection Band's coming in to rehearse, and they will hurt your ears. Okay. God bless. See you later.